Most of you will know that in the year 1798, a massive rebellion against British rule happened in Ireland. I didn't know until a short time ago that an important battle in that rebellion happened right here in Kilbeggan. I'm sitting in the meeting room of Kilbeggan Library. Within a musket shot of where I am sitting, this climax of the epic revolutionary events of 1798 in the county of Westmeath went down. And I'm here to tell you a bit about it. This is based on a talk I gave here at the library last month. And I hope you find it as interesting as I did. I'm deeply indebted to Kathleen Flynn and Stan McCormack, who wrote this excellent book. Without that book, there would be no talk for you to listen to. To begin with, let's set the scene for what life was like for somebody growing up around Kilbeggan who might have taken part on one side or the other in the rebellion of 1798. It was a key town in the area with 4 fairs a year. Flax and weaving were important industries hereabouts. It took 7 hours to get up to Dublin in those days, if you can imagine that, on a horse and cart. The horses and carts would leave twice a week for supplies. They'd leave at midnight and arrive there around the Thomas Street area around 7 a.m. Perfect for getting in touch with revolutionary leaders located in Dublin, by the way, but we'll get to that. Population was around the same as it is today, less than 2,000 people. It was a very active social life that people had. Horse races, wakes, patterns, bonfires, turf cuttings, religious confraternities, social occasions of all kinds. But it was also a time of poverty, inequality and injustice due to the system of landlordism that prevailed over Ireland at the time, where a tiny minority of very wealthy landlords, most of whom were from a minority religion, the Protestant religion, lorded it over everybody else. This was a time of real violence and brutality. And if you look into records, you see that, for example, up in Naas around this time, there was a fella hung, drawn and quartered. That means he was chopped up into 4 pieces. There was a fella in Athlone, a soldier, who was lashed 1,000 times. He couldn't possibly have survived. The yeomanry down in Moat had a particular practice they liked called carding, which is even too graphic to describe here, but it involved putting nails in cards and scraping on people's skin. There was a real wealth gap and a power gap in the country, and that brutality was in the service of maintaining that power gap and that wealth gap. Most people around here lived in mud hovels. There'd be a hole in the roof for smoke to get out. You might have a few stools, you might have a few tools, you'd have a few animals living in the house with you. Not cats and dogs and gerbils, I mean pigs and goats and sheep. It was also a time when people were fighting back. This was a time of agrarian struggle and religious divisions. The penal laws forced Catholics into being second-class citizens, but also they had to pay a tax to support the Protestant church. That was called a tithe. You had the volunteer movement in the 70s and 80s, which showed that even many people within the system wanted to change it. It was like a more privileged layer, and it was a more moderate reform movement, but it was completely dismissed by the powers that be. So things went more radical. In the 1780s, you had a group called the White Boys, and what they wanted was improved wages, cheaper land, and the regulation of tithes. When they failed, things went over more to the Defenders in the 1790s, and the Defenders were distinguished from the White Boys in that they were more inclined to violence. And some of the people who came to the talk actually were able to give me some interesting details on this stuff. It's funny how the local brings the general into focus and the past brings the present into focus. There are people here now in living memory who remember their families paying rents to people called Lamberts. Lamberts were the landlord family who owned a lot of the land around Kilbeggan in 1798, and they still did in living memory because of how the rebellion turned out. But we'll get to that. Another radical group that was developing was the United Irishmen. This was the era of the French and American revolutions, where monarchs were beheaded, sovereign republics were set up, the land of the landlords was taken and shared out among the farmers, and the foundations of democracy laid. So people in Ireland saw this, including many Protestants who were in the leadership of the United Irishmen, and they set up the United Irishmen to campaign for an Irish independent republic along the French and American lines. The United Irishmen were set up in 1791, banned in 1794. In 1796 they had their big missed opportunity when the French army was going to land and help them, but was driven off by bad weather in a show of rotten luck. Westmeath was actually really active compared to other counties in all this activity. The social occasions that I talked about before, the turf cuttings, bonfires, wakes, etc., these were all used as a cover for the secret societies to recruit people and to talk to people. For example, there was like this religious group that used to meet out in Kilbeggan, Maria. They were actually, when they were supposedly saying prayers all night, they were actually talking about revolution all night, planning, overcoming the last doubts and fears, talking about what the post-revolutionary situation might look like, talking about how to bring it about. Masses of people were involved in this. So there was a guy called John McManus, who was the son of a distiller here in Kilbeggan. His dad owned a distillery on the Brosna that was later bought up and made part of Locks. So this is a visible part of the history of the town that you can see in the landscape of it. McManus, anyhow, was in his 20s. He became the leader of a group of several thousand people, United Irishmen, defenders and other people who were based around Kilbeggan, Castletown, Balnagore, Horseleap, and who were ready to go. On May the 2nd he sent a report to the United Irishman headquarters in Dublin saying, we're ready to rise up. There's about 200 government soldiers. We're able for them. Just give the word. Going against this, however, we have the fact that the prelude to the 1798 rebellion was one of terror. So in 1797, there were lots of defender activity, lots of United Irishmen activity, lots of rich people's houses being attacked. But then the government responds with an absolute reign of terror, where there's loads of people shot, loads of people's houses burned down. For example, there was a guy called Hempinstall of the Wicklow militia. Hempinstall was known as the walking gallows because he was really tall enough that he could hang people on his back, and he did. The Wicklow militia brought a reign of terror to the people of Westmeath under Hempinstall. For example, one night there was a failed highwayman, a highway robber, a local petty criminal who was caught before he could carry out his crime. And to get out of punishment, he gave information on the local United Irishmen. That led to Hempinstall showing up at the house of a local blacksmith. The blacksmith's name was Carroll. He had 3 adult sons living with him. They were making pikes for the United Irishmen. Hempinstall finds the pikes hidden. He has the 3 adult sons and the father shot on the spot, and the house burned down. Their bodies are put in a cart and brought to Ballymore. 3 guys are arrested and dragged along behind the cart. At the Fairgreen in Ballymore, the 3 arrested captives are publicly tortured and then executed on the spot. The Westmeath Grand Jury, on which sat distinguished figures like the landlord Lambert, gave a medal to the Wicklow militia to commemorate their great services in the interests of law and order. Many are the examples we could give of similar actions across Westmeath. So we come to the rebellion itself. Most of you will know that the main centres of the rebellion were up in Ulster and down in Wicklow. The main leadership were arrested before the rising could start, so it was in disarray. But on the 23rd of May, on the given date that was set for it, there was risings around Kildare, Meath and Dublin as well, smaller affairs. In early June, imagine you're in Kilbeggan, you're in McManus's organisation, you're ready waiting for the signal to rise up. You know stuff is going down in Ulster and Wicklow, although it's coming through the rumour mill. You know stuff is happening in Kildare and Meath. So you're ready to go. On the 8th of June, it's unknown why, McManus goes on the run and is arrested in Meath. On the 13th of June, 3 United Irishmen are hanged down in Ballycumber. So it's possible that the people in Kilbeggan thought, well, we better strike now because they're after us anyway. So on the dawn of the 17th, the government troops in Kilbeggan are in readiness because they got a tip-off. And sure enough, at dawn on the 17th of June, they see on the Hill of Doon down the Comer Road on the west side of town, across the Brosna, a body of several thousand rebels gathering, pikes and pitchforks, loaves of bread in their pockets, organised into companies of around 100. The events of that dawn are a little confused. It seems that there were several attempts to enter town. Different small groups of rebels made various different attempts to enter. But here's what the main offensive was: across the bridge and up the main street there in town. Now, the government troops, along with the yeomanry, who would be local volunteers who supported the government, set up a barricade right outside Whelan's shop, just off the square. And a large body of rebels came up the main street, around where they hit where Londis and the Garda station are now. The first volley of musket fire tore into them. The crowd paused, halted in confusion and fear, and then the second volley tore into them. They turned and ran. At that point, the government forces unleashed their cavalry. The riders came after the rebels who were fleeing. One rider is said to have slaughtered 14 fleeing rebels. And it was a scene of indescribable slaughter that people found when they arrived later in the day to see what the news was, to follow up on the rumours. They found the main street of Kilbeggan in a very bloody state. Now, Stan McCormick and Kitty Flynn have gathered letters from the time that indicate that the wealthier families in the area feared that their people, i.e. their servants and tenants, would join the rebels. Another letter says they attacked between 4 and 5 a.m, that there were different groups involved, and that local inhabitants shot dead several, and that the person writing the letter actually shot dead one of the rebels. Quote, Mrs. Blank shot one man breaking her window, and I had so good aim I settled another which dispersed that group. End quote. The letter says that some prisoners were brought in, shot or hanged on the spot. And the letter writer predicts that other prisoners will be brought in and will suffer. There was only one casualty on the defending side, on the government side. One Mr. Nolan got 2 thrusts of a pike but was not seriously hurt. The letter writer concludes, quote, this has been a glorious day for the town. End quote. And he says also that they killed over 150 of the rebels. Let's go into the details more on the one defender who was wounded. There was a guy called Michael McDonough who lived on the square. He joined the rebels. He saw Nolan shooting dead one of his comrades, so he came up behind him and stabbed him a few times with a pike. 2 other men fired at McDonough. They stopped him, though they didn't kill him. He was arrested and later tried and executed in Mullingar. Many were executed after this. McManus himself was executed in late August, even though his trial relied heavily on people who were tortured and people who were clearly lying. There was a reign of terror in the local area. In Ballinagore, 10 civilians were murdered in the aftermath of the rising, not by the government forces, but by civilian paramilitaries. There was one guy hanged in the crane right here in the square outside the library. So it was a very grim ending. Now, it wasn't fully the ending. People in Kilbeggan who had taken part in the rebellion and then laid low afterwards would have waited on tenterhooks while the French landed in September. General Cornwallis of the British forces was passing through Kilbeggan and was camped outside town when he heard that the British forces had been defeated and routed by the French up at Castlebar. In aid of the French, there was a rebellion up in Multifarnham. They took over Wilson's Hospital School. That rebellion was defeated, and the French were defeated, and it was a grim ending for the rebels here in Kilbeggan. However, it has to be said that there was another side to the legacy of the rebellion, in that some of those who suffered the terror in this period went on to settle scores later on in quieter ways. Between the 1850s and the 1870s, there were 40 murders connected to land disputes in Westmeath alone. How many of these were people settling scores that went back to 1798? There was an unusually strong tradition of agrarian unrest, ribbonmen, the Land League and such in the Kilbeggan area. Throughout the Napoleonic Wars, fearing a repeated arising, the British Army had a bigger garrison in Kilbeggan than it had up in Mullingar. Thanks very much for listening. I hope this little talk has enriched your understanding of local history and history generally. Thank you.